Welcome back, everybody. We're going to be focusing, as we usually do, on the economy first. So our question will be, how did changes in the organization and use of land, labor, and capital lead to structural changes in the economy? So again, how did changes in the organization and use of land, labor, and capital lead to structural changes in the economy? And so we're going to start by reviewing a little bit about this idea. Usually agriculture isn't the thing that gets most people extremely excited, but it's actually a pretty interesting and important subject if we're going to understand history, especially if we're talking history at a time when the agricultural sector made up so much of the economy. So I want to go back to the early Middle Ages, and when we're talking early Middle Ages, we're talking primarily right around the time of the fall of Rome and the next couple of centuries. This was a time of barbarian invasions, a time of illiteracy. You remember all of that. It was also a time of very low agricultural productivity. This may not come as a surprise. It's kind of hard to sow seeds and plant when you have barbarians running around the countryside. Furthermore, it was a time of ignorance, and many of the better agricultural techniques that the Romans and others had developed had pretty much fallen by the wayside. And so early Middle Ages has very low agricultural productivity, and when you have low productivity, by the way, you can think of in terms of how much output each farmer produces. So if farmers aren't very productive, they're not creating very much of a surplus, and so we need more farmers. But as farm productivity goes up, one farmer can not only feed himself, his family, but he can also start to feed other people. All right? So basically what you want to do with productivity is produce more food in the same amount of land using less labor. That's the ideal. And so it was a time of low productivity, and so the early Middle Ages couldn't support very many people who weren't doing agriculture. So probably over 90% of the population in the early Middle Ages was involved in farming or some sort of food production, and only a very small little tiny percent, the church and the nobility essentially, could do other stuff. Okay. We also talked about in the early Middle Ages that there were some important improvements. You may remember the heavy plow, the windmill, all of these food producing and labor saving devices that began in the high Middle Ages and allowed workers to be more productive. So workers became a little more productive, and as a result of that, during the later Middle Ages, we could begin to support townspeople, right? In other words, had the workers had been as unproductive as they were in the early Middle Ages, well, then we wouldn't have been able to support towns. It just wouldn't have been enough food. But once labor becomes a little more productive, we can not only support the church and nobility, but also towns. Okay, so more productivity. So productivity again is each farmer producing more in the same amount of land. All right. And when this happens, you need less agricultural laborers, so some of them could move into towns and do other stuff. Another pattern I want to look at is the demographic trends in the Middle Ages. So looking at this graph, you can see that around the year 200 AD, this is at the height of the Roman Empire, the population peaked, and then in the next couple of centuries, as barbarians started to infiltrate, the population dipped by about a third, and around 600 it bottomed out and then began to climb. We know around the year 1000, this was kind of a bit of a landmark year, because around that year, this is when those new improvements started to come onto the scene, and there was more stability. And so the population really began to climb. But then what happened is labor productivity slowed down. There weren't any new advances coming on. The population continued to grow, and people started to become short of food. It's evidence that the weather got worse. People started to eat less well, and pretty soon disease came in. And so you can see in the 1300s there that the economy falls off a cliff, and that's known as the Black Death. And it took a couple of centuries, but then began to rebound before dipping again in the 1650s. So the population trend was generally on an uptrend, but it wasn't in a smooth straight line, because what would happen is some new advances would come on, and then people couldn't keep up with the advances, and the population would grow and people would die. And so that was the trend throughout most of the Middle Ages and most of human history, really, for that matter. It's kind of a sad truth that had a lot of people who have starved to death and died of diseases on the planet. All right. Well, I want to look a little bit at medieval agricultural practices, and one of the things that would strike people as a little different, at least compared to today, is the idea of land ownership. Most people think that if they own a house, it's theirs, and of course people say, well, the mortgage, but in general people think, well, it's my house, I own it, I live here, it's mine. So we're used to this idea of absolute ownership. Once we own it, nobody can take it away from us, and it's ours. The Middle Ages had a very, very different view of ownership. They didn't have this idea of absolute ownership. All right. And so when we go to the early modern period, and so a lot of this carries over to the early modern period, serfs weren't really serfs anymore. They were peasants. So their position had been improved substantially since the Middle Ages. So they were technically free. They could marry, they could inherit, they could own property, they could move if they wanted to move. So they were technically free. They were peasants now, not serfs. They weren't bound to the land. But in most cases, they didn't own land. It's true their family may have occupied the same piece of territory. They may have farmed it for many generations, but technically the land wasn't owned by them. They were tenants on the land. That meant that there was a lord somewhere who technically had a claim to the land, even though, you know, the peasant had lived there for many, many generations. It wasn't technically his, and so he was a type of sharecropper or perhaps a tenant of some sort. Either way, he didn't technically own the land. And so what this meant is that he was subject to the jurisdiction of the noble whose land he operated on. All right. So this may have entailed some kind of fees that he had to pay for the use of this land. If he wanted to sell the land or to lease the land himself, he had to pay fees usually. In addition to that, there were strict rules about where you could process the food. Okay, so with wheat and grapes and things like that, you don't eat the food whole. You have to bring it to be milled or to be pressed. And if you were on the Lord's land, you had to have the food processed in his facilities. So either use his press or use his mill or whatever it was. And because this was an absolute right of his, he would, no surprise, often gouge people for the use of this. All right. In addition to that, there were some very strict rules on hunting. Kind of a funny thing about the Middle Ages and even the early modern period is hunting was a sign of prestige. All right. And lords were very, very peculiar about this. This was something that they felt really distinguished them from the serfs or the peasants, and they worked really hard to keep this monopoly. And so even if it was your land or the land that you'd been using, you couldn't kill any animals on it. In other words, if there was a deer, you couldn't say, oh, some free meat tonight. No, it's the prerogative of the Lord to do that. So it sounds like a bit of a maybe a stingy thing to do. But where it really came to harm the peasants, sometimes some of these animals were pests, like rabbits that would eat food. And, sometimes you just want to, trap the little bugger and get rid of him. But there was very harsh penalties because this was considered hunting on the Lord's land. Well, between some of these strange rules and the various taxes, peasants still ended up forking over about 50% of all the food that they produced to the landowner. And this usually left them very little on their own. They didn't, maybe just enough to feed their families if they were lucky. And so that was a bit disadvantageous to them. Another peculiar thing about medieval farming is people used what's called a three-field system. Okay? And so the lands around the village would be divided into three sections typically. One field would be used to plant wheat, let's say. The second field would be used to plant barley. So people in the Middle Ages and even beyond tended to favor what we call cereals, wheat, barley, grains have a lot of caloric value, so pretty easy to grow too. So they would divide the fields into three, and you would always have to leave one field fallow. All right. And for those of you who aren't farmers, fallow means you don't plant anything on it. You just kind of let it go. And the reason you do this is you do this so that it can rest for a year. All right. You might put animals on it, but you want the field to rest. And the reason is because cereals have a tendency to strip nitrates out of the soil. Nitrates are apparently important for crop growth, but cereals strip those out of the soil. And so if you were to keep producing the same cereal on the same land, eventually all the nitrates would be gone and it wouldn't grow anymore. And so people knew by trial and error that you had to give the field a vacation every 3 years. And then the next year you'd rotate. All right. And so this was a necessity, but what it meant was that in any given year, 1/3 of all the land in Europe would be out of productive use, right? Because it was on vacation. Another facet of this, and something we'll see that they changed later, is that people tended to segregate where they kept their animals. All right, so they keep their animals on a big open area called the common ground. Right, common area. And this common area would be a place where the animals would be able to feed and grow. Matter of fact, cities like Boston are so old, you may be familiar with the Boston Commons, right? And it goes back to an older time when people would actually keep all of their animals, all the villagers of Boston would keep all of their animals together in a big open grassy area. All right, so this was a necessity, but it was maybe somewhat wasteful because, like I said, about 1/3 of your land was not being used productively. Another interesting aspect of the Middle Ages was this idea of communal farming. Very different than what we think of as farming today. So, villagers would have their land outside of the village, but typically your land would not be all together. All right, so there would be the three fields. You can see the three fields pictured here. Okay. But typically what would happen is they would divide the land into different strips. And so, for example, in this picture here, the red represents the land holding of one farmer, and you can see that there's red scattered in different fields. All right. And so they favored this long type of strip farming. And the reason for this was that turning around the oxen that were used to plow, or the horses that were used to plow, was a pretty big deal. And so they tended to favor these long strips. And they favored mixing them around. That way nobody got all the good land and nobody got all of the bad land. All right. Now, one of the side aspects of this is if it's a big open field, so you can see that these are three fields and they're big and they're open, is that as a farmer I couldn't say, you know what, I don't think I'm going to do wheat this year. I think I'm feeling like broccoli, right? You couldn't do that because it was really all part of the same field. You just had access to part of it. And so it meant that things were done communally. So all the peasants had to get together and decide what it was that they were going to be growing this year. All right. And because you owned land within that larger field, you had to go along with it. And usually the peasants came up with the same thing. It's like, how many people think wheat? And, everybody's hand goes up because that's pretty much what they grew. All right. And so you're really bound by the village's decision, even if you didn't think maybe that was the best course. All right. And so there is this idea of communal farming. Okay, well, this is the system that had existed, from the late Middle Ages on, once peasants got their freedom, and it existed for quite a long time in continental Europe, that is, Europe outside of Great Britain. But this system began to change in Great Britain during the 16 and 1700s. Now, a big part of what became known as the Agricultural Revolution is the idea of enclosure. All right? And this was the idea to begin to consolidate farmland. All right, so all the peasants have their strips. The idea of enclosure is to begin to consolidate those into different blocks and then to fence them off rather than the open field that had previously existed. All right. And so now you create blocks of territories. Now, but of course, peasants have a claim to this land. They may say, well, we've been doing it this way for a long time, and thanks, but no thanks. We'll keep it the way it is. And so this would require an act by the government. In England, it would have been Parliament. Parliament would have to, in some cases, force people to agree to this. All right. Basically, what you needed was you needed the land, 80% of the landowners to agree to this. Now, this wasn't in terms of an absolute number. You just needed the person with 80% of the land to agree to this, and then Parliament would usually pass an act and allow this, and it did this over and over again. And so what they would do is they would send out surveyors to figure out how much each peasant had, how much the main landowner had, and then they would reallocate it, okay? And once the land was reallocated, it would be fenced in, and it would be privately owned at this point. So you would have you'd be given a private title, a deed to the land, and it was yours, and you could do whatever you wanted with it. There was no attachments. There was nothing like that. And so you could plant whatever you wanted. This idea of the communal aspect began to disappear. And so in this picture here, you can see it, a typical English community before the enclosure. There's maybe a lot of small little farms scattered around. And then if you see it afterwards, well, they've kind of been consolidated. And typically what would happen during this process is smaller farmers would often be bought out, or if somebody was leasing their land, the tenant might not lease it again. So there was a movement not only to enclose the land, but to create larger farm sizes. All right? And so you'd buy out the small guy, not lease to the tenant, maybe even expand into some of the wasteland. You'd carve up the common land. The common land in this picture is in green. This is where the peasants previously would, keep their cattle and whatnot. And you'd carve that up as well. And basically it would all be fenced in, and it would become a larger farm. And typically what a landowner would do is he would lease it out to big farmers. All right, so instead of having all these little guys on the farm, uh, these little farms, you'd lease it out and create big farms and lease it out to wealthier farmers who could afford to plant it more effectively. Now, the question you may be wondering is, well, what happens to the little farmers? Well, they become landless peasants, essentially. They become day laborers if they're lucky. So they may be rehired, but they'll be hired when we need them, maybe during the harvest, maybe during the planting, maybe during the summer to weed, but that's the only time we're going to need them, and then the rest of the year they have to go somewhere else and do something else. All right, so it creates a lot of landless peasants, but you do get larger farms. Okay, another aspect of this reorganization is that you start to get a different sort of structure, the three-tiered structure of rural England. So at the top you'll have a gentry landowner. This is a person who owns these large territories now. He'll rent this out to a middle-class farmer, and this middle-class farmer has a big farm that he's leasing, and he'll work it, but typically what he'll do is he'll hire out some of these poor landless laborers. All right, and this becomes the new social structure in English life, okay? At least rural life. All right, so you may be saying, well, okay, so you've reorganized the land and you've reorganized the labor. You've got things that are definitely different, but so what? Well, these landlords and farmers cooperated together to farm these farms more or less commercially. All right? So as we know, in the early modern period, there was increasing urbanization. Cities were growing, particularly in England. London was becoming a behemoth, growing very, very rapidly. And there was really, really high demand for food. And so these people were driven to reorganize and to farm more effectively by these high prices of food. They wanted to capitalize on it. And so they were there seeking a profit. And they were really responding to the growth of these cities. And so these individuals tended to be farm managers. They tended to look at the land more as a source of profit rather than as something to maybe eat and live off of. All right? This was a money-making endeavor for them. And so most of these farmers could read and write. They would keep books, all right, of, income versus losses. They would use wage laborers. So unlike before where the peasant would be living on the land and supporting a family, well, now you would hire them as you needed them, all right, and use labor wisely and try to squeeze it a bit and make a profit, all right. And this would involve usually less labor than under the old system. Not all of the farmers would be needed and hired back as your farm became more efficient. Also, these individuals would keep up on the latest in science, most likely. So there were agricultural societies that were beginning to develop in England and elsewhere, and various experiments going on how to best use your land. All right. And because they were wealthier, they could also make capital investments in their land. A lot of people are scared by this word capital. What does it mean? Basically, what this means is making improvements on your land, spending money to make improvements on the land so that it yields more and is more productive. And so let's look at some of the things that they could do to begin to get more out of their land. One of them was the use of convertible husbandry. Convertible husbandry. Now, that may sound like something you want to drive in the summertime, but it's not. Convertible in this sense means converting from agricultural land to pasture land, to places where you raise livestock. And so, what some of these savvy people began to realize is there was no need to leave a third of your land unproductive. If you were to plant it with certain things like turnips or like clover, you could use these to feed your cows or your sheep or your pigs or whatever you were growing on it. And these cows, you could keep these cows on your land, and this land that had been fallow, and you could keep a lot of them there if you planted the right crops there. And the beautiful part about this is these cows would not only be there and be available as a source of meat or dairy or whatever they were there for, but they would be dropping manure on the land all winter long. All right. And so this had the effect of revitalizing the land and increasing its productivity with all this extra manure. In addition to that, people began to realize, some of these scientific societies perhaps, began to realize that there were certain plants that would not steal nitrogen from the soil, but would actually return it to the soil. All right. These types of plants, there's a couple of different varieties. Clover, which you could also use to feed your cows, was good. Legumes, these are things like chickpeas and beans and these sorts of things, also do this. They actually suck nitrogen out of the soil and put it back into the soil through their roots. And so you could plant these nitrogen fixing plants in the ground, and they would help restore the soil. All right. Or if you found yourself with soil that wasn't good for some reason, plants like damp soil but not soaking wet soil. Sometimes if the soil's too clay-like, then the plants you'll get root rot. And so savvy farmers would sow sand in, and this would help with the drainage. Or sometimes you had the opposite problem, it was too sandy, and then the water just passed right through it without watering the plant. And so you could add lime to the soil, and this would help bind the soil so you could plant. So there's various soil improvements of different types you could do. Now this would have all obviously been impossible with the open field system. So the system, because you'd have to get all the peasants to agree, and you just didn't have your own farmland really. And so by consolidating it into private property, you could begin to make these improvements as an investment. Another thing that savvy farmers began to do, and really again you needed to be a big farmer to do this because you needed to have the capital to invest, but is using farm machinery. So there were some new tools coming out that greatly helped farmers. One of them was called the seed drill, and this was actually developed by a man by the name of Jethro Tull. He's not just a 70s rock legend. He was an 18th century English inventor, and what he did is he found that by creating this machine, he could plant seeds in rows. Okay, so this machine, if you wheeled it along, it would plant seeds in rows, but better yet, what it would do is it would space out the seed. So farming in the Middle Ages was very inefficient because people would grab big handfuls of seed, and many of the plants would choke each other out. And so with this machine, you could spread the seed out evenly, and so you had these nice even rows and plants spaced evenly apart. Okay, and you ended up using way less seed. Something like you went from you became 4 or 5 times more productive in your seed use. Furthermore, because the plants were now in rows, it became a lot easier to weed them. And so Tull invented another machine called the horse-drawn hoe. And this machine would just pass through the rows and it would pull up all the weeds that would grow. So if you were scattering the seed all over the place, it would be a big jungle of plants, and it would be harder to weed. But now that they were in nice rows, you could weed them easily with the horse-drawn hoe. And so this meant, once again, you need less and less farm labor. You invest a one-time investment in one of these machines, and our farmers are being more productive with the same amount of land. You're cutting back on labor. There were also improvements in stock breeding, livestock improvements. All right. During the course of the 18th century, the size of cows in London doubled. And this was thanks in part to scientific breeding. Once again, this is one of the benefits of the scientific revolution. People began to experiment with different breeds and different types of cattle. And they were able to create not only larger cattle, but cattle that would mature at a younger age. So they'd get big and they'd get big fast, which is what you want, because you don't want to spend many years with, waiting for the cow to grow and have it eating food and whatnot. And so you want the cow to grow, or the sheep or the pig or whatever it is, to grow as big and as fat and as fast as possible. Also, by scientific breeding, you could design animals who had more meat to bone. So obviously the bone isn't very useful, but the meat is. And so these animals would be not only bigger, but they'd be meatier as well. Something we've touched on already is the use of fodder. So part of convertible husbandry and part of some of the new crops that people were experimenting with meant that you could begin to grow foods that would not only enrich the soil, but there would be food that could be used to keep more animals alive. One of the aspects of the Middle Ages is oftentimes in the fall you'd have to slaughter your animals because you knew all the plants were going to be dying and you wouldn't be able to keep many animals alive. So this is why people ate really well in the fall. You ate well in the fall because the rest of the year you weren't going to have any more animals until the spring. But with these new crops that people were developing, the amount of food for animals began to grow, and so you could have bigger animals and more animals dropping manure. So it was a kind of a virtuous cycle. And so not only were people eating better, but animals were eating better as well. All right, so no one of these things in and of itself was a game changer, but all of these things, as well as other things, began to have a cumulative effect. And beginning here, this is similar to the graph I showed you at the beginning. Beginning around the 1750s, the population began to grow. Only this time it didn't have a correction. It kept going up, and it kept going up, and it kept going up. Up until I think there's a little dip there, that's World War II. But other than that, the population of Europe has steadily increased. And this is because agricultural advancement has come at an ever-increasing rate, and farmers have been able to keep up with the pace of growth, all right, by continuously improving the quality of existing land and spreading to new lands. In addition to better food, I should also mention that there were some medical improvements. So smallpox, a smallpox vaccine was developed at this time. Also, through quarantine and for other reasons, plague, people were able to isolate and to keep plague at bay. So part of it was disease, but it was mostly due to this increase in food. All right, so we have more people, so let's think about this. Farmers are obviously more productive, so we need less labor per farmer, and we also have more productive land. So what would we expect to happen to the structure of our economy? Well, if you guessed, more productivity meant that we needed less agricultural workers to feed an ever-growing amount of people. And so you can see that Well, there's not many more church people, not many more nobles coming onto the scene, but the number of townspeople that we're going to be able to support is going to grow. And I should mention, as more and more agricultural advances come not only in the 18th century, but in the 19th and the 20th century, the percentage of agricultural workers has continued to decline. Could be wrong, but I think in the United States, for example, right now, we use 3% of the population is involved in agriculture of some sort. It's obviously way down from the 90+% of the Middle Ages. All right. Well, what I'd like you to do is to think about this, review your notes, and answer this question. How did changes in the organization and the use of land and labor and capital lead to structural changes in the economy? So when we talk about structural changes, we mean the way the economy is set up. All right? And the various things that people do. All right. I'll see you next time for our next lesson.